The deed felt heavier than it should have in John Croft's weathered hands as he stared at the farmhouse that was supposed to be empty. 3 women stood on the porch like sentinels, their strong frames casting long shadows across the wooden planks. The tallest, with dark, piercing eyes and an air of authority, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her composed expression. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice carrying a musical cadence that belied its strength. But there was something else in her tone. Something that made the hair on John's neck stand up. The other 2 women flanked her sides, equally tall and powerfully built, watching him with the intensity of predators sizing up their prey. John had traveled 3 days through rough terrain to reach this remote property. His life savings were invested in what the seller promised was fertile land, perfect for cattle ranching. The isolation had been part of the appeal, a chance to start fresh away from the complications of town life. Now standing in the dusty yard with these 3 strangers claiming his space, that isolation felt more like a trap. "Ladies, I think there's been some confusion," John said, keeping his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. "This is my property now. I have the legal documents right here." He held up the deed, the official seal still crisp and new. The woman's smile widened, becoming more enigmatic. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, John Croft. We've been expecting you." The way she said his name sent a chill through him. How did she know who he was? The seller had assured him the transaction was private, that no one else knew about the purchase. "We've been living here for quite some time," the second woman spoke up, her voice deeper than her companions. "Taking care of the land, keeping it warm." She emphasized the last word in a way that made John's stomach tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The third woman, her jet black hair streaked with auburn from the sun, let out a low laugh. "The previous owner made certain arrangements with us before he left. Arrangements that don't just disappear because of a piece of paper." John felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against his chest. These weren't ordinary squatters or confused neighbors. There was something deliberate about their presence, something calculated that made him question everything about his purchase. The seller had been eager to close the deal quickly, almost suspiciously so. Had he walked into some kind of setup? What kind of arrangements? John asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The tall woman's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite amusement. "The kind that involve you staying here with us permanently." She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the blow that would change everything. "You're going to make love to us, John. All 3 of us. That's how this works." The words hit him like a physical blow. Not from desire, but from the sheer audacity and the strange intimacy of the demand. This wasn't seduction, nor was it a simple threat. This was something else entirely. Something that made his hand instinctively move toward the rifle on his horse. But what exactly was he walking into? And why did he have the sinking feeling that his deed might not be worth the paper it was written on? John's hand froze halfway to his rifle as the implications of the woman's words sank in. This wasn't some crude proposition. The way they stood, the confidence in their voices, the casual mention of arrangements with the previous owner, everything pointed to something far more complex and dangerous than simple intimidation. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," John said, forcing steel into his voice despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. "But I paid good money for this land, and I'm not going anywhere." He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, while maintaining eye contact with the leader. The tall woman chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Game? Oh, John, this isn't a game at all. This is business." She gestured toward the farmhouse with a sweep of her strong arm. "See, the man who sold you this property owed us something. A debt that doesn't disappear just because he ran off with your money." The woman with the sun-streaked hair stepped forward, her boots heavy on the porch steps. "Preston Cole made promises he couldn't keep. Said he'd work the land with us, be our partner in more ways than one. When that didn't work out, he promised us the next owner would honor his commitments." Her dark eyes fixed on John with unsettling intensity. "That would be you." John felt the first real stab of panic. Preston Cole. That was the seller's name. Though the man had introduced himself as simply Preston, the details seemed too specific to be a lie, too personal. How much did these women actually know about his transaction? Even if that's true, which I doubt, no man can make promises on behalf of someone else, especially not those kinds of promises. The second woman, darker-haired and broader through the shoulders than the others, laughed. You really don't understand how things work out here, do you? When you're this far from civilization, from law, from any kind of help, traditional rules don't apply. We make our own arrangements. The way she emphasized arrangements made John's skin crawl. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money or property disputes. These women had created their own system, their own form of control, and somehow his purchase had walked him directly into their web. The deed is legal, John insisted, though his confidence was wavering. Filed with the territorial office, witnessed, sealed. Whatever Preston Cole promised you personally has nothing to do with me. The leader's smile finally faded, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Legal documents mean nothing out here when you're 3 days from the nearest sheriff and even further from anyone who might care what happens to a stranger. She took a step closer and John was struck by just how imposing she was, tall and powerfully built from years of hard physical labor. Besides, the sun-streaked woman added, we have our own paperwork. Contracts Preston signed, agreements that specifically mentioned the transfer of obligations to any future owner. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, and John's heart sank as he recognized what looked like official letterhead. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that made John's investment seem less like a business transaction and more like an elaborate trap. Had Preston Cole sold him into some kind of arrangement deliberately? Was this whole property sale a setup to deliver him to these women and whatever scheme they were running? The document the woman held looked official enough to make John's mouth go dry. Even from several feet away, he could make out what appeared to be signatures and an official seal at the bottom. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Preston Cole actually bound him to some kind of contract through the property sale? You're bluffing, John said, though his voice lacked conviction. No court would honor a contract that involves forcing someone into whatever this is. The dark-haired woman stepped off the porch, her boots hitting the ground with authority. Who said anything about courts? We handle our own justice out here. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, and John found himself taking an involuntary step backward. My name is Mylin, the leader said, her tone shifting to something almost conversational. This is Leanne. She nodded toward the dark-haired woman. Annan, the woman with the sun-streaked hair, gave a small wave that somehow managed to be both friendly and threatening. We've been waiting for you for weeks, John. Preston described you perfectly. The casual use of his first name sent another chill through him. How much had Preston told them? What other details about his life did they know? Whatever Preston told you about me, he had no right. I bought this property in good faith, and I'm not bound by any agreements he made. Maylene's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, John caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath the intimidating exterior. Good faith, she repeated almost wistfully. That's refreshing. Preston wasn't much for good faith, especially toward the end. She studied John's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You're different from him. Quieter, more substantial. Leanne circled around to John's left side, moving like a predator, but with an odd gentleness in her eyes. Preston was all charm and promises at first. Swept in here talking about partnership, about building something together. 3 months later, he was already looking for an exit strategy. He used us, and added, her voice carrying a hurt that surprised John. Took advantage of our hospitality, our work, our... She paused, searching for the right word, affections. Then decided it was too much trouble, and ran off with the money from selling the land we improved. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a clearer picture, though it wasn't one that made John feel any safer. These women weren't just squatters or con artists. They had been betrayed by Preston Cole. And now they saw John as either their salvation or their revenge. So you see, Mylin continued, moving closer until she was close enough that John could smell the faint scent of jasmine tea on her clothes. We have a legitimate claim here, not just to the land, but to what we were promised. What Preston committed to, and then abandoned. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. John found himself caught between the rational fear of his situation and an inexplicable pull toward these three women who had upended his carefully planned future. There was something magnetic about Maylene's confidence, Leanne's quiet strength, and Anne's fierce independence that he couldn't ignore. "Show me this contract," John said finally, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "If Preston really signed something that binds me, I have a right to see exactly what it says." Anne unfolded the document with deliberate care, and John stepped closer to examine it. The paper was thick, expensive, with Preston Cole's signature clearly visible at the bottom alongside an official notary seal. But as John read the terms, his confusion deepened rather than clearing. "This is a partnership agreement," he said, looking up at Mayline. "For farming operations, profit sharing, Anne." He paused at a particularly unusual clause, mutual support and companionship for all parties involved. The language was carefully crafted, legally binding, but vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. Preston was clever with words, Leanne said, moving to stand beside John as he read. Her proximity was distracting. She was tall enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and he caught the scent of something warm and earthy, like sandalwood and summer rain. He made promises that sounded romantic, but were actually business arrangements, and vice versa. Mayline watched John's face as he processed the document. "The land has been profitable under our management. We've built irrigation systems, improved the soil, established trade relationships with settlements 2 days' ride from here. Preston benefited from our work for months before deciding he wanted out. But instead of honoring his commitments," and added, her dark eyes flashing with renewed anger, "he found a buyer and disappeared with the money, leaving us with nothing but a piece of paper that apparently transfers his obligations to whoever bought the property." John set the contract down carefully, his mind working through the implications. These women had been more than partners to Preston. They had been lovers, workers, and business associates rolled into one complex relationship. And according to this document, Preston had legally bound any future property owner to step into his role. "Even if this contract is legitimate," John said slowly, "I didn't sign it. I can't be held responsible for agreements made by someone else, no matter what the paperwork says." Maylene's expression shifted, and for a moment, John saw past the intimidating facade to something raw and vulnerable. "You're right," she said quietly. "Legally, you're probably not bound by Preston's promises. But morally, we've invested everything into this land, into this arrangement. We have nowhere else to go." The admission hung in the air between them, changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. These weren't predators trying to trap him. They were women who had been abandoned and were desperately trying to protect what they had built. Leanne stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "We're not asking you to honor every detail of what Preston promised. But we are asking you to consider that we might be able to build something better together than any of us could alone." John felt his resistance wavering as he looked at each of them in turn. Maylene's strength masked a deep loneliness. Leanne's quiet confidence couldn't hide the hope in her eyes. Anne's fierce independence was built on a foundation of hurt that she was trying desperately to protect. "What exactly are you proposing?" John asked. And even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The three women exchanged glances, and John realized that his answer would determine not just his immediate future, but potentially the rest of his life. Whatever came next, nothing would ever be simple again. Mayline stepped forward, her imposing frame somehow less threatening now that John understood the pain behind her strength. "We're proposing a real partnership," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Not the half-hearted arrangement Preston offered, but something genuine. We work the land together, share the profits equally, and..." She paused, meeting his eyes directly, "We share our lives." The weight of her words settled over them like morning mist. John found himself studying each woman with new eyes, seeing past the intimidation to the loneliness that had driven them to this desperate gambit. They weren't trying to trap him. They were trying to save themselves and offer him something he hadn't even realized he was looking for. "The three of you," John said slowly, testing the waters. You've been together since Preston left. The question carried implications that made his heart race with a mixture of curiosity and unexpected desire. Leanne nodded, a faint blush coloring her strong features. We found comfort in each other after he abandoned us. It started as survival, but it became something more, something we didn't want to lose. Her honesty was disarming, and John felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. And moved to stand beside her companions, creating a united front that was no longer threatening, but strangely appealing. We know how it sounds, she said, her dark eyes locked on his. 3 women asking a stranger to join them in something most people would never understand. But out here, conventional rules don't apply. We make our own family, our own bonds. John's mind raced through the possibilities and consequences. He had come here seeking solitude and a fresh start. But what they were offering was the opposite: connection, partnership, and an intimacy that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but another part, a part he had long suppressed, whispered that this might be exactly what he needed. The physical aspect, John said, his voice rougher than he intended. What would that mean exactly? The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and uncertainty. Maylene's smile returned, but this time it was genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time since he had arrived. It would mean whatever feels natural to all of us, she said simply. No pressure, no demands, just the freedom to explore what develops between us as we build something together. The honesty in her response surprised him. This wasn't about coercion or fulfilling some obligation to Preston. This was about 4 people finding solace and connection in an isolated world where traditional relationships often meant nothing. And if it doesn't work? John asked, though even as he spoke, he could feel his resistance weakening. There was something about the way Leanne's eyes softened when she looked at him, the way Anne's fierce independence seemed to include space for him, and the way Maylene's strength promised protection rather than domination. Then we figure it out like adults, Leanne said simply. But John, we've been watching you since you arrived. The way you handle yourself, the respect you showed even when you were frightened. We think it could work. We hope it will. The admission that they had been evaluating him just as much as he had been evaluating them somehow made the proposition feel more balanced, less like a trap, and more like an opportunity. But was he brave enough to take it? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as John weighed the most important decision of his life. I need to see what you've built here, John said finally, his practical nature asserting itself, even as his heart raced with possibility. If we're talking about partnership, I need to understand what I'm partnering with. Maylene's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it behind her usual confidence. Of course. Leanne, show him the irrigation system you designed. The pride in her voice when she spoke of Leanne's accomplishments was unmistakable, and John found himself drawn to the genuine affection these women shared for each other. As Leanne led him toward the fields, John was amazed by the sophistication of the water management system she had created. Channels carved with precision directed water from a natural spring to carefully planned garden plots and grain fields that showed signs of careful cultivation and impressive yields. And joined them as they toured the livestock areas where healthy cattle grazed in well-maintained pastures and a small but productive chicken coop provided fresh eggs. We've established trade relationships with 3 different settlements, she explained, her business acumen evident in the way she discussed profit margins and seasonal planning. The operation is not just sustainable, it's thriving. John found himself genuinely impressed. This wasn't just a farm. It was a carefully planned and expertly managed operation that had the potential to support all of them comfortably. As they entered the farmhouse, he was struck by the warmth and comfort of the space. It was clean and well-crafted, blending Western practicality with subtle, beautiful touches from their heritage. We're not asking for an answer today, Leanne said as they settled in the sitting area. But even as she spoke, John realized that his decision was already made. The attraction he felt wasn't just physical, though he couldn't deny it. More than attraction, he felt the pull of belonging. These women had created something remarkable together, and they were offering him the chance to be part of it. The risks were enormous, but so was the potential reward. What happens next? John asked, and all three women smiled, understanding that his question was really an answer. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, John felt truly alive. That evening, as they shared a meal prepared together in the spacious kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to cautious optimism. "There's something else you should know," Mylin said as they cleared the dishes, her tone growing serious. "Preston left us with more than just broken promises. There are debts he incurred in our name. People who expect payment that we can't provide alone." And pulled a ledger from a drawer, her expression grim. "Supplies he ordered but never paid for. Equipment purchased on credit. He used our reputation with local traders to secure goods, then disappeared before the bills came due." She opened the book, revealing columns of numbers that made John's heart sink. The debts were significant but not insurmountable, especially given the productivity he had witnessed. Their honesty about the financial burden impressed him. Preston really